Today I want to discuss about a thing which is an issue in Muslim world, especially in Arab world. Why Arabs are lying at and what it will give, what it is giving to them. Because when we see different narrations specifically or specially about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we see that Arabs almost always lying, and they are lying almost constantly, or they lying in a very infantile and goofy way that you see that he's not believing what he's saying. So this is the problem, that when I hear the Arab narrations, I know that they are talking like they were on a TV set or a movie set. This is not their actual beliefs. They actually have a role in this spectacle, even if it's documentary, even if it's some kind of a program. They behave like that, and it is really important to understand that today's Arab are really different than an Arabs before them. Than Arabs who, for example, conquered many different religions, countries like Byzantine Empire, Sassanid Empire, so Persian Empire, and then later they moved to today's Afghanistan, Pakistan, and they conquered India. And in the West, they conquered almost whole Spain and coastlines of Africa, but they were honest in their plan. Yes, that they need to spread Islam by sword. Everyone who disobeys them need to pay taxes, but he's still a second-class citizen. Or the best way is to force him to submission to Islam, or even kill him. But they weren't savages. They were conquering these lands as later, let's say, conquistadors conquered Americas. They conquered them fair and square, and these were like great. Even if we hear about this topic in elementary school, we see that the topic is great Arab conquests. So they were really great in scale, but also in the magnitude and meaning for that time and period of our times and for that world. And right now the only thing which can they do is to lie, and they almost lie about everything. For example, they lie not talking about suicide attacks. So they purposefully don't talk about very cruel, very horrific kind of terrorism, when someone is putting a bomb on itself and blowing it or detonating it in front or near to people, to cause and to kill or to murder as many of them as they can. And it is even though in Islam suicide or this kind of savagery is forbidden for those specifically young 20, 30 years old men, it's not important. Their way of thinking about it is more important than what official Islam is saying about it. And for example, when we see an Arab or Palestinian Israeli conflict, they lying in a way that they, for example, they feel that they are oppressed, which is a lie, because they are not oppressed. They are oppressors because they conquered these lands in 6th century of Common Era, and they murdered, slaughtered all Christians, Jews who disagree with them, and destroyed their temples, or almost all of the temples. Mm, so they were oppressing the native inhabitants of those lands. And specifically because, let's say, Christians, Byzantine Christians, they were not native, because the native population of the lands were Israelis, were Jews, or were other kind of ethnicities from the earlier period of Alexander the Great empire and its subsequent countries. So it was like mixed population of native population of Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Greek population. So they were the natives. Then Arab came. They also mixed to some extent with those populations, but they conquered it. They conquered it. They killed whoever opposed them, and they built their own temples on the destroyed temples of different other religions. This is an example of Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is on the ground where Romans in first century of our era, of Common Era, destroyed the temple, the Jewish temple, because the Jews were making an uprising against the Romans, and they built their own mosque, their own temple on the ground. But if the temple was stood at that time, they would surely destroy it, as they did in many other cases in India, in today's Pakistan, Afghanistan, or Iran. And maybe this is not unusual, because, for example, Christians, when they were conquering Americas, they do the same. They killed the native population, they destroyed their temples, and they built their own temples. And when, for example, Christianity in Roman Empire won, it of course destroyed all other temples of these earlier polytheistic religions of, let's say, Jupiter, Hera, Apollo, and so on. But today is 2025, and Arabs want to they are also lying that they are the victims. And they are of course not the victors, they are conquerors, they are oppressors, because they win this battle with different religions. Native lands of the Arabs, of modern day Arabs, is Saudi Arabia Peninsula, and Saudi Arabia Peninsula, with countries like Oman, Yemen, United Emirates, Qatar, and so on. But other than that, other lands are the spoils of war of Arabs who were conquering in the name of Islam other religions, other countries. And for them it is of course the path to glory, because they even said in the Quran that jihad, so the war against the disbelievers, is good, or it's almost the best way you can do as a Muslim. So for example, destroying temples of Buddhists and on the Hindus in the east was good because they were disbelievers. So as destroying the temples of the Jews and the Christians, because they were disbelievers. This is a common term used in Quran, the holy book of Islam, and it is of course a very good term to demonize your opponent, to say that he was worthy and he needs to be killed, to be subservient to you, to be your slave, or to be murdered. And also Arabs are lying, saying that Jews were oppressing them from 1948, so the year when Israel as a country was established, and the October 7th massacre was a retaliation for this oppression. But it is of course the lie, because Jews are not savages, they are not murdering people like that and in that way, and you cannot just give the proof, the rational proof of such behaviors, and Arabs knows that such proof just simply doesn't exist. Because when we focus on modern day Arabs, for example, they murder people in most vicious and horrible way you can imagine. For example, attacks from the 21 of 10th September on the Twin Towers and on Pentagon. It was conducted by Arabs who were also Muslims, young men, 20 something years old. Ali Akcha was one of the oldest, 30 something years old. They hijacked planes, civilian planes with population on them, and they fly into the towers with themselves and the living people on the planes and in the twin towers. Fortunately for the Americans, the casualties were like 3,000 something dead, so they were not as much as the Muslims should or the Arabs were expecting, but nevertheless it was a really very vicious way of murdering people. Until that time, probably no one heard about such an idea, such a brutal, horrific idea, but the Muslims thought about that, and they did their plan. And so, as for example, when we have a couple of years ago a bombing of Catholic churches in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, Muslims and Christians are the minority. Majority is Buddhists, and they are minority. Nevertheless, the Muslim minority, and they were knowledgeable enough to know that when the greatest holiday for Christian is, and this is of course the resurrection of the Christ, the Sunday when the Christ was resurrected and defeated death, and on that day in April they sent suicide bombers and they entered into the Catholic churches so they can murder as many Christians praying there as they could, and they murder 200 something Christians, mostly women and children. So we see that Islam is they are also lying that the religion of Islam is a peaceful religion. Of course, it cannot be a true, because Islam conquered vast territories of lands, of empires, and subjugated their population to their beliefs. So such a religion which considers killing other people of other religions as a martyrdom, it cannot be peaceful. It's more like a death cult than a religion, because Muslims, also young Muslim men, also detonating bombs on fellow Muslims. So, for example, it was the case of Iraq when Sunni Muslims were sending suicide bombers to Shia neighborhoods, and Sunnis and Shias are the different, let's say, strains of Islam, and many young Sunnis think that Shias are just disbelievers as other religions, or even worse than disbelievers of other religions. So, for example, we had a withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan, and a young Muslim of Hindu origin, 30 something years old, detonated himself on one of the airfields in Afghanistan, in the capital, Kabul, and he murdered like 200 something Muslims which were escaping from this poverty-stricken primitive country to America. And he just, as a Muslim, as a believing Muslim, he just detonated himself and murdered as many Muslims as he could. So for him, they probably were just disbelievers as other religions. So Arabs are also lying, not telling us about these things. They just omit them. If, for example, some case is different for them or difficult for them, they not talking about it, or they want to believe that they are the victims of this of their aggressions, or their viciousness. For example, when the massacre of October was conducted, and you can see that these young savage degenerates were, for example, kicking the body of dead Israeli soldiers, or they were punching a body of some taxi driver near the mosque, that they were rather happy with that. And most Muslims knew that proofs are too strong to be just denied. So they were not talking about this massacre. Instead, they did, for example, in Great Britain, in many West European countries, they did a parade against the occupation of Israelis, to saying that the Palestine should be free. But Palestine is free because the occupation started of Palestine from modern, let's say, perspective, when Arabs were conquering these lands from Byzantine Empire, from Christian Empire, and for Jews the Palestine is free now because the Jews were subjugated not only to Muslim rulers when Arab conquests were being conducted, but they were also subjugated to Christian rule, and earlier to the Roman, let's say, Roman polytheistic rule, and even earlier to the Assyrian rule to some extent, to the Babylonian rule, to the Persian rule, and to the Greek rule in times of Alexander the Great. And for example, Arabs are lying that Jews want to exterminate Palestinians, that they want to genocide them. But this saying is because they know that they are aggressors, so they cannot say that they are the real aggressors and the real oppressors. So they use the term which for them has no meaning, because the term genocide is a very unique term, a new term, and it was started of being in use when Germans, Austrians, but also other nations like Hungarians, like Poles, wanted to slaughter Jews, but the Germans wanted to slaughter them in a very structural, organized way. And this kind of destroying and wiping out the whole bunch of people was called the genocide. So when you don't want just to take a terrain or be secured or have a secure empire, you just want to murder the people just for murdering them, and not because of other reasons. So for example, genocide in a case of Israelis would be even difficult to prove, because the Israelis were attacked. They were slaughtered in October massacre. So they just responded to this massacre, as for example, Irish think that Northern Ireland is occupied by Great Britain, and they conducted a massacre of Britons, for example, in London. So even though from them perspective it's okay, because factually Ireland was conquered by Great Britain, but nevertheless, and it was ruled by many centuries. Nevertheless, such a massacre would never be a normal way of gaining an independence or fighting with an occupation, because every kind of normal, rational people would know that if you conduct a massacre on your opponent, he can conduct even greater massacre on you. So if you, for example, it was the case of Sri Lanka in the north, when Tamil Tigers wanted to have their own country for Tamil people. And they were a terrorist organization, and they have some claims to this land because they were transferred there or transported there during Britain Empire by the British to the north of Sri Lanka, and they were fighting for their own country, and they have lost. The Tamils they have lost from the government of Sri Lanka, and no other. Even though the last days of Tamil Tigers were massacres of the women, raping them. We have even a documentary about killing fields in Sri Lanka. Very brutal documentary about specifically about killing and murdering Tamil fighters or not, civilians or not. It was really vicious documentary to see, but no government even maybe a little bit have a protests, because they knew that even if your case in some extent just, you cannot be a savage. You cannot just murder people because your case is just. So, for example, for me, if my family was killed by some other people, I cannot just have a retribution of my own that I will take a gun and I will murder all the perpetrators. And this is even to more extent when two countries are fighting, because then the casualties are far greater and consequences for two countries are very, very severe. For example, when Hamas, so Palestinians from Hamas decided to conduct this slaughterhouse of Jews, they probably knew that couple right now it's about 60,000 of Palestinians killed, and 22 of them, something like that, are Islamic operatives, Hamas operatives, and other than that, they are the rest is civilians. But from my perspective, if my, let's say, resistance would just slaughter some Jews and later on my people would be slaughtered even more, because Hamas killed, like, murdered like 1,200 Jews, and from my perspective as an Arab Palestinian, I have lost, let's say, tens of thousands of my citizens, my fellow citizens. It would be a disaster for any organization, terrorist or not, Islamic or not. It would be just a failure, because right now we are not sure if, for example, Gaza will be reoccupied by Israelis, because they withdraw in 2005. Then Hamas took by violence rule from the Fatah movement, because Palestinians have different movements also, and he ruled it with an iron fist. So it was not governed in democratic way, and there were no Israelis, no Israeli temples. They even excavated graves, because they knew that they will be destroyed by the Muslim Arabs. So the Arabs are lying to that extent that they are probably believing in their own lies, and this is because and why Middle East is almost always in constant war. Because even in their holy book, the Arab holy book, the Muslim holy book, the holiest of the books is the Quran, and they think that literally the words in the Quran are not inspired by God. They are not inspired by, let's say, Muhammad, or they are not even inspired by Archangel Gabriel, who was telling those words. They just think that it was God himself who was telling those words. For them, they are literally the word of God. Because, for example, for Christians, the Bible, or for Jews, the Bible, Tanakh, is just inspired by God, but written by humans. But Arabs and Muslims have this irrational idea, because we cannot prove that. Yes, you cannot prove that something was written by God or was written by humans, or let's say you can rather prove that it was written by humans to far extent better than you can prove that God decided to say those words, to utter those words, or to say that, but because utter is I think a negative term. And because Arabs are believing in all those lies, even to some extent, I think they are constantly at war. We saw that war in Syria right now. It's maybe 300,000 dead. It's right now over, but maybe even more was really killed. In Yemen, the civil war between Sunnis and Shias, maybe 200,000. In Iraq, the slaughterhouse between Sunnis and Shias, maybe 200,000. So all this world in Muslim world uh, are only telling us that Muslims are completely not, to some extent, or even completely not aware of their savagery state. That they just murder people, then they lie about it, and they are constantly lying because they don't even know mm, how to fight for their independence. Because let's say they say that they are oppressed because of the Israelis. Okay, so even if you believe in that, but this is a lie, but even if you believe in that lie, you cannot fight for your independence with slaughtering people, especially civilians. And but even soldiers, you cannot just slaughter them and then expect that nothing will happen. We have the case of for example, I'm from Poland, and right now Ukrainian soldiers are fighting with Russian soldiers. Russia attacked them. The Russia, of course, didn't say that it is a war. It is more like a military operation. And right now they lost 200,000 soldiers, but they conquered like and they are now occupying like 20-25 of territory percent of territory of Ukraine. So of course violence can be fruitful for those who are violent. This is the case of Russia. Russia, for example, Red Army or USSR defeated the German army, and they occupied many countries in Europe, and many of them subjugated to their own communist rule. So the violence, like we see that violence not always produced only evil. It can sometimes produce evil or destruction for those who have lost. So, for example, for Russians, even though they have lost more soldiers than Ukraine, they conquered some lands. So violence for them is not as bad. The same to the same extent, Arabs, when they were conquering from Arabian Peninsula different lands, they conquered whole today's India and Bangladesh, and whole Spain. But some of these countries, like Spain or like India, regained their independence, because in India it was more complicated, but it because in the end of 18th century India was conquered by the British, so let's say Christian Protestants. But nevertheless, right now India is independent. Hindus are ruling, but they still have like 200 million Muslims in India. And India was partitioned by the British, so we have also almost 200 million Muslims in Bangladesh and in Pakistan. So we see that this violence of Muslim world was fruitful for the Islam, because, for example, the biggest numbers of Muslims are not Arabs, and they are not in Arab countries, but they are in southern Asia, specifically in today's modern days Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. It's about 600 million Muslims. So so Arabs, and to some extent Muslims as a whole, they are lying with everything. Yes. So for example, they are talking about killing of the children in Gaza. But of course, the children and the civilians will be killed, because, for first of all, they started it. Second of all, Hamas knows that they don't have airplanes, submarines, or even heavy weapons, so they hide in Gaza and in highly urban population areas, when civilians will be killed, and even if they will be killed, they will be even more radicalized, because if Palestinians from Gaza, they weren't supporting the Hamas, they weren't calling it they are calling the Hamas the resistance movement, because it's literally, Hamas is an abbreviation from Islamic resistance movement. So they support it, because if they weren't supporting it, they would just chose or or decided that some other entity should rule them. But no, they support it, and even though they are being killed, they are to this kind of cultistic, nihilistic belief that they don't understand that they are the victims of their own hatred. They are the victims of their own aggression, because they could, for example, rule Gaza, and to some extent agreed with Israelis on some points, and just live their own life, even if they are not agreed on everything with Israelis. But the Hamas doesn't recognize Israel and thinks that this country is just an occupation country. When you hear about Arabs talking about Jews, they rarely, very rarely use the term Israelis, even Jews. They mostly use the terms occupiers. Yes, so this is like an unknown being of being an occupier. So they don't recognize even that there is a state, and it is a quite rich and quite, even though very small, quite rich and quite powerful state. They don't even recognize Jews as Jews. They just saying about them like they were a thing or something, that they are an occupation force. So they even don't focus on their humanity. And for them, of course, it's almost like a cult nihilistic believing, because right now they cannot win with Israeli army. They can to some extent mitigate this, but what they were expecting, that they murder some Jews, they kidnap many more, and they will survive. No countries can allow that, because not only Muslim countries, but any other country, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, and there are no other Jewish countries, but let's say they are, no country can accept that you are a terrorist organization, murder some people, and you want something, a country, a money or something, because to that extent you can always use violence, and this primitive violence, because because earlier, when the Arabs were conquering the world, for them this violence was fruitful. They extend their own religion, their own beliefs, their own culture, their own architecture, their own way of writing, and so on, and they upgraded and developed those things. For example, they build mosques on the plains, or in characterization from Eastern Christian temples, like domes. Yes, we have domes in Muslim temples. They, for example, conquered India, and they used Indian numbers to even upgrade them, and we know them as Arab numbers. So those conquests were not only savage conquests of barbarians. They created new civilization, new religion, new architecture, new style, new language, new even poetry to some extent, new way of understanding how women should wear their clothes, and so on. But right now, they just lie about anything, and they cannot do anything properly. They cannot do anything properly. When we see that most wars, the most destructive wars in Muslim world, are civil wars. So they are between different factions, or often between different strains of Islam, Sunnis versus Shias, basically, in Syria, in Yemen, and so on. And they cannot do anything else than perpetuating and conducting war, which is for them the worst thing, because it degenerates all in them and outside them. It degenerates the infrastructure, buildings, schools, hospitals, mosques, but the way of thinking about everything. How they can teach about history, teach about medicine, if they only focused on making a holy war against all others, because they think that in their meaning, in organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, and so on, every Muslim can even be a traitor, a disbeliever, a kuffar, and so on. So this nihilistic attitude toward life brings them only death and more death, because they, for example, Hamas just kidnapped some hostages. Some of them were released. Right now, it's probably 40 hostages, 20 dead, 20 alive. But they expect that they will be ruling Gaza from the point of any country, even Muslims countries. Such young men, very aggressive, very destructive. They are completely out of touch with reality. So let me say this: I wasn't expected. This is maybe the one asset of the Arabs, that they are so brave to die. I wasn't expecting this, because right now we have knowledge that from the Israelis' point of view, it's like, I don't know, 500 died soldiers. I'm not sure if it's with this massacre of Hamas, but let's say 600. Let's say official numbers are like 500. Maybe with the massacre of October, it's 600, even 700. But Hamas operatives lost 22,000 operatives, fighters, mostly young, 14 to 30 years old. So all those young men decided that nevertheless they could just study, they just could learn, they could have families and do something for Gaza City and for its citizens. They decided death. And they also decided death to their families, because if they are fighting in the cities, in the urban areas, which gave them the advantage that they can use civilians as human shields, and then later accuse Israelis of killing the civilians. But other than that, it's completely wasteful, because they lost their life, their families will lose their life, their children will lose their life, and everyone, even though, for example, right now many countries accuse Israel and even of genocide, most those countries are all Islamic countries or Christian countries, and Christians and Muslims never liked Jews, and they even hated them, because Judaism is the oldest religion than Christianity and Islam, and many of holy books or ideas in Tanakh, in Jewish Bible, is copied by the Christians and by the Muslims to lesser extent, and by Christians to greater extent. That almost whole Tanakh, whole Hebrew Bible, whole Israeli Bible is an Old Testament in Christian Bible, because we have Old Testament. This is the Hebrew Bible, and there are some complications, and there is a New Testament. But Protestants have less books, and we Catholics have more books than in Tanakh, in Jewish Bible, and this is the main difference. But other than that, it's just copied. But the interpretation is different. That for us Christians, Jesus Christ was, and we can, from our perspective, find his teachings, his birth from those scriptures. But Jews don't interpret this like that, like us. So these religions are different, and they are hostile each other. So Jews know that Christians and Muslims will be hostile toward them, because their religion was first. But right now we have 17 million Jews and maybe 2 billion something Christians and 1 billion something Muslims. So really, I'm not sure what will Arabs achieve by lying about almost everything, and not and do not knowing that this tactic is completely fruitless. It completely destroys whole their culture as a whole, as a religion, as a moral, as an ethical way of living. So my appeal to the Muslims and to the Arabs is stop lying and improve your religion. Let's Islam not be a cult religion, a death cult religion, but a truly big, formidable, advanced religion, and not something like that. Like you have a young man. I saw those recordings, and they were horrifying. They were really horrifying. They were really horrifying, conducted by young Muslim men. Really horrifying. Do not create or make your religion a death cult. Improve it and start making it as a worthy, big, formidable religion.